There are approximately 4,000 inscribed objects sitting in museums across India, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom. They are small. Most of them fit in the palm of a hand. They are made of steatite, a soft soapstone that was carved when pliable and then fired to a glass-like hardness. Each one bears a combination of two things: a carved animal, usually a bull, a rhinoceros, an elephant, or a creature that does not appear to exist in nature, and a short sequence of symbols arranged in a neat horizontal line along the top edge. The symbols are precise, carefully formed, and instantly recognizable as writing. They follow consistent patterns. They obey identifiable rules of spacing and directionality. They are, by every formal criterion that linguists and epigraphers use to distinguish writing from decoration, a script. And after nearly a century of sustained scholarly effort, not a single one of those symbols can be read. The objects are seal stones from the Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, one of the three great urban cultures of the ancient Bronze Age world, contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia. At its peak, between roughly 2600 and 1900 before the Common Era, the Indus civilization covered an area larger than either of its contemporaries, over 1 million square kilometers, stretching from present-day northeastern Afghanistan through Pakistan and into northwestern India. It contained at least 5 major cities, dozens of towns, and hundreds of villages. Its largest city, Mohenjo-daro, had an estimated population of 40,000 or more and featured a sophistication of urban planning, standardized brick sizes, grid-pattern streets, covered drainage systems, public baths, and multi-story residential buildings that would not be matched in the region for 2,000 years. This was not a marginal culture. This was one of the foundational civilizations of human history, and its writing system, the system that recorded its language, administered its economy, and expressed whatever thoughts its literate citizens chose to preserve, is the oldest undeciphered script in the world for which a substantial corpus exists. The numbers are striking. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been catalogued, bearing approximately 417 distinct signs. The average inscription is devastatingly short, fewer than 5 signs. The longest known inscription contains only 26 signs. No inscription has been found that scholars can confidently call a sentence. No bilingual text, an inscription in both the Indus script and a known language, has ever been discovered. No Rosetta Stone exists. No traveller's dictionary, no diplomatic letter, no merchant's glossary survives from any contemporary civilization to provide even a single translated Indus word. 4,000 objects, 400 signs, 5,000 years of silence. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why this silence persists. You are going to learn what the Indus script is, what we think it records, why every attempt to read it has failed, and why its undecipherment matters far more than an academic puzzle. Because the Indus Valley Civilization was not just one of the oldest urban cultures in the world. It was one of the most enigmatic. It left behind cities of extraordinary sophistication, but no evidence of kings, no monumental temples, no depictions of warfare, no royal tombs, no self-glorifying inscriptions. It appears to have been a civilization without a visible ruling class, a society that achieved urban complexity, long-distance trade, and cultural uniformity across a vast territory without any of the usual instruments of centralized power. If the script could be read, it might reveal how such a society was organized, how it maintained order without obvious hierarchy, how it coordinated the activities of hundreds of thousands of people across 1 million square kilometers without the apparatus of authoritarian rule. That knowledge, the knowledge of how to build a complex, prosperous, apparently egalitarian civilization, is locked behind a script that no one can crack. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let us begin. The story of the Indus Valley Civilization's rediscovery begins with a railway and ends with a mystery that has consumed 3 generations of scholars. In 1856, British engineers were constructing a railway line between the cities of Karachi and Lahore in what was then colonial India. The route passed through the Punjab region of the Indus River Valley, a flat, fertile plain where millennia of riverine silt had created deep deposits of alluvial soil. The engineers needed ballast, crushed stone to lay beneath the railroad ties and stabilize the track. Local workers directed them to a vast mound of ancient bricks near the village of Harappa, where the ruins of a dead city had been quarried for building material by local populations for centuries. The engineers took the bricks. They crushed some of the oldest urban architecture in human history into gravel and laid a railroad on top of it. The destruction was not total, but it was severe. By the time professional archaeologists reached the site, decades later, much of Harappa's upper levels had been stripped away. The irony is painful. The first contact between modern civilization and the Indus Valley Civilization was an act of unwitting destruction. A civilization that prided itself on engineering, using the engineering of its ancient predecessor as raw material. The true nature of the Harappan ruins was not recognized until 1921, when the Indian archaeologist Dayaram Sahni began systematic excavations at Harappa under the auspices of the Archaeological Survey of India. Almost simultaneously, the British archaeologist R.D. Banerjee was excavating a large mound at a site called Mohenjo-daro, roughly 600 kilometers to the southwest, in the Sindh region. Both sites yielded similar artifacts, the same distinctive pottery, the same standardized bricks, the same carved seal stones bearing unknown symbols. The realization dawned slowly but unmistakably. These were not isolated settlements. They were nodes in a vast, integrated civilization that had been completely unknown to modern history. The discovery was a seismic event in the world of archaeology. Before Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the earliest known civilizations of the Indian subcontinent dated to the Vedic period, roughly 1500 to 500 before the Common Era. The Indus Valley Civilization pushed that date back by a millennium or more, revealing an urban culture that was not only older than anyone had expected, but also fundamentally different from anything that followed it. The cities of the Indus were not like the cities of Mesopotamia or Egypt. They had no ziggurats, no pyramids, no colossal statues of rulers. They had no recognizable palaces. They had no fortified citadels bristling with weapons. What they had was infrastructure, sophisticated, meticulously planned, almost obsessively standardized infrastructure. The urban planning of Mohenjo-daro remains one of the most astonishing achievements in the history of city building. The city was divided into two main sections, an elevated western mound, sometimes called the citadel, and a larger lower eastern section that comprised the main residential and commercial area. The citadel contained what appeared to be public buildings, including the structure known as the Great Bath, a large, watertight pool measuring approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and nearly 2.5 meters deep, surrounded by a colonnaded walkway and accessed by staircases at either end. The pool was lined with carefully fitted bricks set in gypsum mortar, and it was made waterproof by a layer of bitumen, natural asphalt, applied to the interior walls. A sophisticated drainage system allowed the pool to be filled and emptied, with wastewater carried away through a covered channel. The Great Bath has no parallel in the contemporary ancient world. It is not a reservoir. It is too elaborately constructed, too carefully waterproofed, and too prominently located to serve a purely utilitarian function. Most scholars interpret it as a ritual bathing facility, a structure associated with purification ceremonies that may have been central to Indus religious practice. If this interpretation is correct, the Great Bath represents the earliest known public structure, built specifically for ritual purposes in South Asia, a precursor, by over 3,000 years, of the ritual bathing tanks that are a defining feature of Hindu temple architecture. But without the ability to read the script, this interpretation remains speculative. The building speaks through its bricks. It does not speak through its words. The residential area of Mohenjo-daro was equally remarkable. The city was laid out on a precise grid, with major streets running north-south and east-west, intersecting at right angles. The streets were wide, the main avenues approximately 10 meters across, and lined with covered drains that carried wastewater from individual houses to larger municipal sewers, which ran beneath the streets and emptied outside the city limits. Every house had its own bathroom. Many had indoor wells. The bricks from which the city was built were manufactured to a standard ratio, a length to width to height proportion of 4 to 2 to 1. That was uniform not just within Mohenjo-daro, but across the entire civilization, from settlements in present-day Gujarat to outposts on the Oxus River in Central Asia. This standardization extended to weights and measures. The Indus people used a system of graduated stone weights, made of chert, that followed a precise binary decimal progression 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, with remarkable consistency across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. The implications of this standardization are profound and deeply puzzling. Standardized bricks, standardized weights, standardized urban layouts. These imply coordination on a massive scale. Someone, or some institution, was establishing and enforcing standards across a territory the size of Western Europe. In Egypt, that institution was the pharaoh. In Mesopotamia, it was the city-state king. In the Indus Valley, it was what? No one knows, because the archaeological record of the Indus civilization contains no evidence of centralized political authority. No royal tombs have been found. No palatial residences have been identified. No depictions of rulers, no crowned heads, no enthroned figures, no scenes of military triumph appear in the art. No individual is singled out for glorification or veneration in any surviving artifact. This absence is not a gap in the record, it is the record. The Indus civilization was, by every available measure, a complex urban society, a society with specialized crafts, long-distance trade, sophisticated engineering, and cultural uniformity across a vast area. These are precisely the features that in every other ancient civilization are associated with centralized authority. And yet the centralized authority is invisible. Either the Indus people were governed by a form of political organization that left no archaeological trace, which is possible but difficult to imagine, or they achieved their remarkable uniformity through some mechanism other than top-down political control. The answer may lie in the script. If the seal inscriptions could be read, they might reveal the administrative system that held this civilization together. They might show us how 1 million people across 1 million square kilometers maintained standards, resolved disputes, and organized collective action without a king. That knowledge, if it exists, is locked inside 4,000 carved stones. The seal stones themselves are among the most distinctive artifacts of the ancient world. They are small, typically between 2 and 4 centimeters on a side, and square, with a perforated boss on the back that allowed them to be worn on a cord or attached to goods. The front face typically bears 2 elements: an animal figure, carved in intaglio with remarkable skill, and a short inscription along the top edge. The animals are rendered with a naturalism and a sense of life that has drawn comparisons to the best animal art of any ancient civilization. The most common animal is the so-called unicorn, a bull-like creature shown in profile with a single horn, which may represent a 2-horned animal depicted from the side, or may depict an animal that existed and is now extinct, or may represent a mythological creature. Other animals include the humped zebu bull, the water buffalo, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the tiger, and a short-horned bull. Each animal type appears with a distinct set of associated objects. The unicorn is almost always accompanied by a strange object that scholars have variously identified as a ritual stand, a manger, or an incense burner. The consistency of these associations suggests that the animal and object combinations carried specific meaning, that they were not mere decoration but symbols of identity, affiliation, or status. The distribution of animal types across different sites and different periods provides one of the few windows into the social organization of the Indus civilization. The unicorn is by far the most common animal, appearing on roughly 60% of all seals. This dominance is remarkably consistent across sites. The unicorn is the most common motif at Mohenjo-daro, at Harappa, at Lothal, and at virtually every other major Indus site. The zebu bull is the second most common, appearing on roughly 15%. The remaining animals, elephant, rhinoceros, tiger, water buffalo, each account for a smaller share. Some scholars have interpreted this distribution as evidence of a social hierarchy or clan system in which different animals represented different social groups with the unicorn-bearing group being the largest or most powerful. Others have argued that the animals represent religious or cosmological categories, that each animal is associated with a particular deity, season, direction, or element. Without the script, neither interpretation can be confirmed. The mysterious object that accompanies the unicorn on virtually every seal is itself a puzzle within the puzzle. It appears to be a structure of some kind, a platform or table with vertical elements rising from it, and what may be a vessel or offering placed on top. Dozens of interpretations have been proposed. A ritual brazier for burning incense, a feeding trough for sacred animals, a device for filtering or distilling liquids, a symbolic representation of a cosmological concept. The object is depicted with enough consistency and detail to suggest that it represents something real, something that the Indus people would have recognized immediately, but without the script to provide a label or context, its identity remains as mysterious as the script itself. Every seal with a unicorn includes this object. Every seal with this object includes the unicorn. The association is absolute, and the meaning is unknown. But the inscriptions are the heart of the mystery. The signs of the Indus script are compact, regular, and diverse. They include what appear to be pictographic elements, shapes that resemble fish, trees, human figures, jars, and various geometric forms. But the signs are sufficiently abstract and standardized that they clearly function as elements of a writing system rather than as simple pictures. The signs are typically arranged in a single horizontal line, reading from right to left, as determined by the observation that signs are often more compressed on the left side of inscriptions, suggesting that the carver ran out of space as he approached the end. Some longer inscriptions show line breaks, with the direction of reading alternating between lines, a practice known as bustrophedan writing, meaning as the ox ploughs, turning at the end of each row. The brevity of the inscriptions is by far the single greatest obstacle to decipherment. The average inscription contains only 4 to 5 signs. The most common inscription length is 3 signs. Inscriptions of more than 10 signs are rare. Inscriptions of more than 15 signs are exceedingly rare. The longest known inscription, found on a broken piece of pottery, not a seal, contains 26 signs. For comparison, the Rosetta Stone contained over 1,700 hieroglyphic signs. The shortest texts that have ever been successfully used as the basis for a decipherment, the Ugaritic alphabetic tablets, contained hundreds of signs in individual texts. The Indus corpus offers nothing remotely comparable. The individual inscriptions are too short for statistical analysis of word patterns, too short for the identification of grammatical structures, and too short for the application of most standard decipherment techniques. The total corpus, all known inscriptions from all sites combined, contains approximately 26,000 sign occurrences. This sounds substantial until you realize that it is distributed across thousands of individual inscriptions, most of which are so short that they offer minimal information about the structure of the script or the language it records. It is as though someone had given you 4,000 fortune cookies and asked you to reconstruct the English language from the fortunes inside. Each fortune is a few words long. Together, they give you a vocabulary of sorts, but the sentences are too short, too formulaic, and too limited in scope to reveal the grammar, the syntax, or the expressive range of the language. The frustration is intensified by the knowledge that longer texts almost certainly existed. The Indus civilization was a complex, bureaucratic, urban society. The kind of society that, in every other documented case, generates enormous quantities of administrative text. The palace archives of Ebla, a Syrian city roughly contemporary with the Indus civilization, contained over 17,000 cuneiform tablets. The palace at Knossos yielded thousands of Linear B tablets. Even the relatively modest Mycenaean settlement at Pylos produced over 1,000 inscribed tablets. The Indus civilization, which was vastly larger and more complex than any of these, should have produced administrative archives of comparable or greater size. Where are they? The answer, almost certainly, is that they were written on perishable materials. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia survived because Mesopotamian scribes used clay as their primary writing medium, and clay, especially when baked, is nearly indestructible. The Indus scribes appear to have used clay only occasionally, for seal impressions and for a small number of inscribed tablets. Their primary writing medium was probably organic, wooden tablets, palm leaves, cotton cloth, or bark. These materials decompose rapidly in the moist, warm climate of the Indus Valley. If the Indus civilization produced the kind of extensive administrative archives that its level of complexity would predict, those archives are gone, rotted to nothing in the millennia since the cities were abandoned. The seal stones survived because stone does not rot. They are, in effect, the labels on the filing cabinets, the identification tags that were attached to documents, bundles of goods or containers. The documents themselves, the letters, the accounts, the inventories, the legal records, whatever was written on perishable materials, are lost. What we have is not the library. It is the card catalogue. And a card catalogue, divorced from the library it indexes, tells you almost nothing about the contents of the books. This realization is devastating for the prospects of decipherment, because it means that the surviving corpus is not merely small, it is systematically unrepresentative. The seal inscriptions are a single genre of text, identification labels, drawn from a civilization that must have produced dozens of genres. The full range of the Indus script's expressive capacity, its ability to record narratives, laws, prayers, letters, contracts, and all the other functions that writing serves in a complex society, is invisible to us. We see the script only in its most abbreviated, most formulaic, most grammatically impoverished form. Judging the Indus script from its seal inscriptions is like judging the English language from a collection of license plates. You can see the letters, you can count the symbols, but you cannot begin to grasp what the language is capable of. The scholar Asko Parpola of the University of Helsinki, who has devoted over 50 years of his career to the study of the Indus script, has described the situation with a metaphor that captures both the frustration and the allure of the problem. Working on the Indus script, Parpola has said, is like trying to solve a crossword puzzle in which most of the clues are missing, the grid is incomplete, and the language of the answers is unknown. The civilization that produced these seal stones was not static. It evolved over roughly 7 centuries, from the early Harappan period, beginning around 3300 before the Common Era, through the mature Harappan period, which saw the peak of urban development between 2600 and 1900 before the Common Era, to the late Harappan period, which witnessed a gradual transformation and eventual disappearance of the distinctive Harappan cultural traits. The script appears to belong primarily to the mature Harappan period, the era of the great cities, the standardized bricks, and the long-distance trade. The trade networks of the Indus civilization were extensive and well documented through material evidence. Indus artifacts, particularly carnelian beads, which the Harappan craftspeople produced with a skill that was unmatched in the ancient world, have been found at sites throughout Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, and Central Asia. Harappan settlements have been identified on the island of Bahrain, at the ancient port of Lothal in Gujarat, which may have been the earliest known tidal dock in human history, and at sites along the Makran coast of Balochistan. The raw materials found at Indusites, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, turquoise from Iran, tin from Central Asia, gold from southern India, demonstrate a trading reach that was, in proportional terms, comparable to any ancient civilization. The Mesopotamian records provide an external perspective on this trade. Cuneiform texts from the Akkadian period, roughly 2300 before the Common Era, mention ships from a place called Meluha arriving at Mesopotamian ports, carrying cargoes of precious stones, metals, exotic animals, and luxury goods. The description of Meluha in these texts, a distant land across the sea, rich in natural resources, associated with exotic animals and precious stones, matches the Indus civilization so closely that the identification is accepted by the vast majority of scholars. There are even a handful of cuneiform texts that appear to record the names of Meluhan merchants in phonetic cuneiform, rendering Indus names in Mesopotamian script. These phonetic renderings are among the most tantalizing scraps of evidence in the entire Indus puzzle, because they may preserve the actual sounds of Indus personal names, but the renderings are few, their interpretation is disputed, and they do not provide enough data to identify the Indus language. The decline of the Indus civilization, which unfolded between roughly 1900 and 1300 before the Common Era, is itself a mystery that the undeciphered script might illuminate. The great cities were gradually abandoned. Mohenjo-daro shows evidence of declining civic maintenance in its later levels: blocked drains, encroaching habitation in formerly public spaces, a general deterioration of urban standards. The standardization that had characterized the civilization at its peak broke down. Regional variations in material culture increased. The population dispersed from the major urban centers into smaller, more numerous, and more dispersed settlements. The script fell out of use. By roughly 1700 before the Common Era, the Indus script had ceased to appear on any datable artifact. What caused this decline? Climate change, specifically the weakening of the Indian monsoon and the drying of the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which had sustained many of the eastern Indus settlements, is now considered the most likely primary factor. Tectonic activity may have altered river courses, depriving cities of their water supply. Epidemic disease has been proposed. Invasion was once the favored explanation, the so-called Aryan invasion theory, which held that Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples swept into the subcontinent and destroyed the Indus cities by force. But this theory has been largely abandoned by modern scholars who see the decline as a gradual transformation rather than a violent conquest. The script, if it could be read, might settle these debates. Administrative records from the late period might reveal food shortages, water management crises, or social disruptions. Religious texts might show changes in belief or ritual practice that accompanied the civilizational shift. Trade records might document the contraction of long-distance networks. Even simple inventory lists, the prosaic catalogues of grain and oil that administrative scripts typically contain, might reveal the economic trajectory of a civilization in decline. Consider what even partial decipherment would mean. If we could read the seal inscriptions as names and titles, we would know how the Indus people identified themselves: by personal name, by family lineage, by professional role, by geographic origin. This information alone would transform our understanding of Indus social organization. If we could identify the names of deities in the votive inscriptions, we would have the first direct evidence of Indus religion, not inferred from images and artifacts, but stated in the civilization's own words. If we could read the inscriptions on the copper tablets, which are longer than the seal inscriptions, and which appear to serve a different function, we might gain access to a different genre of text with different vocabulary and different grammatical structures. The potential payoff of decipherment is immense, but the potential does not change the reality. The script cannot be read, and so the decline of the Indus civilization, like everything else about its inner life, remains a matter of inference and conjecture. The missing clues are not the only problem. There is also the question of what kind of writing system the Indus script is. A question that should be straightforward, but that has, over the past 2 decades, become one of the most contentious debates in all of archaeology. The conventional view, held by the majority of scholars who have worked on the Indus script, is that it is a logosyllabic writing system, a system in which some signs represent whole words and others represent syllables. This classification is based on the number of distinct signs in the script, approximately 400, depending on how variants are counted. An alphabet typically has 20 to 35 signs. A pure syllabary has 40 to 90. A logosyllabic system, like Sumerian cuneiform or Chinese, has several hundred to several thousand. The Indus sign count of 400 falls squarely in the logosyllabic range. But in 2004, a provocative paper by the archaeologist Steve Farmer, the computational linguist Richard Sproat, and the Indus specialist Michael Witzel challenged this consensus. Farmer, Sproat, and Witzel argued that the Indus signs do not represent a writing system at all, that they are, instead, non-linguistic symbols, comparable to the emblems on medieval heraldry or the pictographic signs used on modern road signs. Their argument rested on several observations: the extreme brevity of the inscriptions, the absence of long texts, the apparent lack of the kind of statistical patterns that characterize linguistic writing systems and the fact that many ancient and modern cultures have used systems of non-linguistic symbols for purposes of identification, ritual, and social signaling without those systems constituting writing. The paper ignited a firestorm. Scholars who had spent their careers working on the Indus script as a writing system were understandably dismayed. If Farmer, Sproat, and Witzel were correct, then the entire project of decipherment was misconceived. The Indus signs could not be deciphered because there was nothing to decipher. The signs were symbols, not language. They had no phonetic values, no grammatical structure, no underlying linguistic content. Attempting to read them as language was like attempting to read a coat of arms as a sentence. The response from the academic community was swift and largely critical. A team led by the computer scientist Rajesh Rao of the University of Washington published a statistical analysis in 2009 demonstrating that the Indus sign sequences exhibited conditional entropy values, a measure of the predictability of sign sequences, consistent with linguistic writing systems and inconsistent with non-linguistic symbol systems. Rao and his colleagues argued that the statistical structure of the Indus inscriptions was too ordered to be explained by random or purely symbolic use, and too disordered to be explained by a rigid, non-linguistic symbolic code. The pattern, they contended, was consistent with language. Farmer and Sproat responded vigorously, arguing that Rao's statistical methods were flawed and that the entropy values of the Indus script were also consistent with certain non-linguistic systems. The debate has continued, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. As of today, the majority of scholars in the field continue to regard the Indus signs as a writing system, but a significant and vocal minority disagrees, and the question remains formally unresolved. The Rao study and the Farmer-Sproat response illuminate something important about the current state of the field: the extent to which scholars have been forced to argue about preconditions rather than solutions. In a normal decipherment scenario, the question of whether the signs constitute writing is settled quickly, and the real work, identifying the language, mapping the signs, and producing readings, can begin. In the Indus case, the field has spent 15 years debating whether decipherment is even conceptually possible. This is not a sign of scholarly timidity. It is a sign of genuine uncertainty, of a problem so fundamentally underdetermined that even the most basic questions about the nature of the evidence cannot be resolved with confidence. The debate also revealed a methodological tension that runs through all Indus script studies. On one side are scholars who approach the problem empirically, who examine the inscriptions, look for patterns, and build hypotheses from the data. On the other side are scholars who approach the problem theoretically, who ask what kind of evidence would be necessary for decipherment and then assess whether that evidence exists. The empiricists tend to be optimistic, the theorists tend to be pessimistic. The empiricists see patterns and possibilities, the theorists see gaps and impossibilities. Both perspectives are legitimate, both are necessary, and neither so far has produced a breakthrough. The most sophisticated recent attempt to bridge this divide has been the work of the computational archaeologist Andreas Fulls, who has used machine learning techniques to analyze the internal structure of the Indus sign system. Fulls' analysis, published in the 2010s, identified clusters of signs that appear to function as grammatical units, potential words or morphemes, within the inscriptions. His work suggested that the Indus script exhibits a level of internal structural complexity that is difficult to explain unless the signs encode linguistic content. But even Fulls was careful to note that structural complexity alone does not prove linguistic content. Structured non-linguistic systems exist. DNA, for example, exhibits enormous structural complexity without encoding language. The question is not whether the Indus signs are structured, it is whether they are linguistically structured. And that question, Fulls acknowledged, cannot be answered definitively from the available evidence. This uncertainty, the inability to determine with confidence whether the Indus signs even represent language, adds a layer of frustration to an already impossible problem. It is not merely that we cannot read the script. It is that we cannot be entirely certain that it is a script. The evidence supports the linguistic interpretation, but it does not compel it. The possibility that we are attempting to read something that was never meant to be read, that we are searching for linguistic content in a system that contains none, haunts the field like a ghost. And even if the signs are linguistic, as most scholars believe, the obstacles to decipherment remain formidable. The inscriptions are too short for meaningful statistical analysis. No bilingual text exists. The language behind the script is unknown. The civilization that produced it left no descendant culture that preserved its language in a recognizable form. The Indus script is, in the classification system proposed by the historian Andrew Robinson, the most difficult category of undeciphered writing, an unknown script recording an unknown language with no bilingual aid and no related script or language to provide a starting point. The lock is sealed, the key is missing, and the 4,000 seal stones sit in their museum cases, small and silent and exquisitely carved, holding their secret with the patience of objects that have been waiting for 5,000 years. Even without decipherment, the Indus script tells us things. It tells us, by its very existence, that the Indus civilization was a literate society, a society that had developed the cognitive and institutional infrastructure required to create, learn, and use a system of written symbols. This is not a trivial achievement. Writing has been independently invented only a handful of times in human history, in Mesopotamia, in China, in Mesoamerica, and possibly in Egypt and the Indus Valley. Each independent invention represents a quantum leap in cognitive and social organization. The Indus people made that leap. The script proves it. The script also tells us, by its distribution, that literacy was widespread. Inscribed objects have been found at over 60 sites, ranging from major cities to small villages. They have been found in residential contexts, in workshops, in what appear to be market areas, and in ritual contexts. This broad distribution suggests that the ability to read, and perhaps to write, was not confined to a tiny scribal elite, but was accessible to a significant proportion of the population. The Indus was, by the standards of the Bronze Age, a broadly literate society. This is consistent with its other characteristics, its standardized weights, its uniform urban planning, its apparent cultural cohesion, and it deepens the mystery of how such a society was organized and governed. The script tells us, by its consistency, that the Indus people shared a common symbolic system across an enormous territory. The same signs, in the same combinations, appear on seal stones from sites separated by over 1,000 kilometers. This implies not just shared literacy, but shared communication. A common language, or at least a common scribal tradition, that bridged the distances between settlements. The cultural unity of the Indus civilization, which is its most distinctive and most puzzling characteristic, is confirmed and deepened by the unity of its script. And the script tells us, by its silence, that we are missing something fundamental about the Indus civilization, something that the material record alone cannot provide. The bricks and the drains and the weights tell us how the Indus people lived. The script, if it could be read, would tell us why. It would tell us what they believed, what they valued, what they feared, what they hoped. It would transform a civilization of objects into a civilization of people, and that transformation, from objects to people, from silence to voice, from mystery to understanding, is the transformation that decipherment would achieve, and that the undecipherability of the script prevents. The core problem of the Indus Valley script can be stated in a single sentence. Everything that would make decipherment possible is absent. This is not hyperbole. Consider the standard requirements for the successful decipherment of an ancient script and observe how systematically the Indus script fails to meet them. Requirement 1. A bilingual text. The Rosetta Stone gave Champollion Egyptian hieroglyphs alongside Greek. The Behistun inscription gave Rawlinson Old Persian cuneiform alongside Babylonian and Elamite. Every successful decipherment of an ancient script has relied, at some stage, on a bilingual or multilingual text that provides a bridge between the unknown and the known. The Indus civilization traded with Mesopotamia. Harappan artifacts have been found at Ur, at Susa, at Bahrain, and at sites along the Persian Gulf Coast. Mesopotamian texts mention a trading partner called Meluhha. which most scholars identify with the Indus civilization. But no bilingual inscription, no text in both the Indus script and Mesopotamian cuneiform has ever been found. The two civilizations traded goods. They did not, apparently, trade languages. Or if they did, the evidence has not survived. Why not? The Indus seal stones found in Mesopotamian contexts bear only Indus inscriptions, not cuneiform translations. The Mesopotamian references to Meluha are in cuneiform only, with no Indus glosses. The absence is puzzling, because bilingual texts typically arise in contexts of diplomatic exchange, commercial regulation, and multilingual administration, all of which should have existed between two major trading civilizations. The most likely explanation is that any bilingual texts that existed were written on perishable materials, on reed, on leather, on palm leaf, that did not survive the intervening millennia. Another possibility is that the linguistic interface between the two civilizations was handled by bilingual intermediaries, interpreters who translated orally and did not produce written bilingual documents. Either way, the result is the same: no bridge exists. Requirement 2. Knowledge of the underlying language. When Ventris deciphered Linear B, his breakthrough came from guessing that the language was Greek, a language he knew well. When Georg Friedrich Grotefend made the first steps toward deciphering Old Persian cuneiform, he worked from the assumption that the language was related to known Iranian languages, an assumption that proved correct. The Indus language is unknown. It has not been identified with any known language family. Proposals have been advanced: Dravidian, Indo-Aryan, Austroasiatic, language isolate, but none has been proven. The Dravidian hypothesis, championed most prominently by Asko Parpola and by the Soviet Finnish team of Yuri Knorozov in the 1960s and 70s, has been the most influential. It argues that the Indus language was an early form of Dravidian, the language family that includes modern Tamil, Telugu, Kannada and Malayalam, currently spoken primarily in southern India. The involvement of Yuri Knorozov in Indus script studies is itself a remarkable chapter in the history of decipherment. Knorozov was the Soviet scholar who had achieved one of the great intellectual triumphs of the 20th century. The initial decipherment of the Maya script. He demonstrated, against the prevailing consensus of Western scholars, that the Maya glyphs were not purely ideographic, but contained a substantial phonetic component, that they could be read as language. His success with the Maya script gave him enormous credibility and emboldened him to attempt a similar breakthrough with the Indus script, using computer-aided statistical analysis, a pioneering approach at the time. Knorozov's team, working in Leningrad in the 1960s, applied what was then cutting-edge computational analysis to the Indus corpus, mapping the positional distribution of signs, which signs appeared at the beginning of inscriptions, which at the end, which in combination with which others. Their analysis identified patterns that were consistent with a linguistic writing system and suggested a Dravidian linguistic affiliation. But the results, while suggestive, were not conclusive. The corpus was too small, the inscriptions too short, and the computational methods of the era too crude to produce definitive results. Knorozov's Indus work, unlike his Maya work, did not achieve the breakthrough he sought. He died in 1999 without having cracked the code. The hypothesis rests on several arguments. The geographical distribution of Dravidian languages, which suggests that they were once spoken over a much wider area than they occupy today. The existence of a Dravidian language isolate, Brahui, still spoken by a small population in Balochistan, in the heart of the old Indus territory, and certain proposed readings of Indus signs as Dravidian words, based on the assumption that specific pictographic signs represent the objects they depict, and that those objects can be matched to Dravidian vocabulary. Parpola's most celebrated proposed reading involves the fish sign, one of the most common signs in the Indus script, a simple pictograph of a fish with clear fins and tail. In several Dravidian languages, the word for fish, mean in Tamil, is homophonous with the word for star. Parpola argues that the fish sign represents the syllable mean, which can mean either fish or star, depending on context. He further argues that fish signs modified with additional strokes or marks. A fish with a roof-like symbol above it, for example, represent specific stars or planets, and that the inscriptions on the sealstones encode astronomical or calendrical information expressed through Dravidian puns. The reading is ingenious. It is also, by the admission of Parpala himself, unproven. The chain of reasoning requires accepting several unverifiable assumptions: that the Indus language was Dravidian, that the fish sign is indeed a pictograph of a fish, that the Dravidian word for fish was the same 4,000 years ago as it is today, and that the Indus scribes employed the same kind of rebus writing, using a sign for one word to represent a homophone that is attested in other early writing systems. Each assumption is plausible, none is certain. The cumulative probability of all of them being correct simultaneously is, by any honest assessment, modest. The skeptics of the Dravidian hypothesis have raised specific objections that deserve attention. The linguist Michael Witzel has argued that the survival of Brahui in Balochistan, often cited as evidence that Dravidian languages were once spoken in the Indus region, may be the result of a relatively recent migration rather than a survival from the Bronze Age. Genetic and historical evidence, Witzel contends, is more consistent with Brahui speakers arriving in Balochistan from the south within the past 1,000 years. If this is correct, the Brahui argument collapses, and the Dravidian hypothesis loses one of its strongest supports. Other critics have pointed out that the fish star homophone on which Parpala's most celebrated reading depends may not have existed in the Dravidian languages of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Proto-Dravidian, the reconstructed ancestor of the modern Dravidian languages, is not known with enough precision to determine whether the words for fish and star were homophonous 4,000 years ago. They are homophonous in some modern Dravidian languages. They may not have been in the language spoken by the Indus people. The reading rests on a linguistic coincidence that may be modern rather than ancient. The alternative hypotheses are equally problematic. The Indo-Aryan hypothesis faces the fundamental objection that the linguistic, archaeological, and genetic evidence strongly suggests that Indo-Aryan languages arrived in South Asia after the Indus civilization had already declined. An Austro-Asiatic identification, linking the Indus language to the family that includes Munda and Mon Khmer, has been proposed by some scholars but lacks any specific evidence beyond geographical proximity. The possibility that the Indus language was a complete isolate, unrelated to any surviving language family, is perhaps the most intellectually honest position, but it is also the most devastating for the prospects of decipherment, because an isolate, by definition, provides no external reference point against which proposed readings can be tested. The Indo-Aryan hypothesis, the argument that the Indus language was an early form of the Indo-Aryan languages, the family that includes Sanskrit, Hindi, Urdu, and most of the languages of northern India, has fewer academic supporters but significant political resonance. In India, the question of whether the Indus civilization was Indo-Aryan or pre-Indo-Aryan is entangled with contemporary debates about national identity, cultural continuity, and the politically sensitive theory of an Indo-Aryan migration into the subcontinent from Central Asia. Some scholars and political figures argue that the Indus civilization was the original home of Vedic Sanskrit culture, and that the script, when deciphered, will prove to record an early form of Sanskrit. This position is not supported by the mainstream of international scholarship. The linguistic, archaeological, and genetic evidence overwhelmingly supports the view that the Indo-Aryan languages arrived in South Asia after the decline of the Indus civilization. But it remains influential in some Indian academic and political circles, and it has generated a substantial body of proposed decipherments that claim to read the Indus script as Sanskrit. The entanglement of the Indus script with contemporary politics is a complicating factor that has no parallel in the study of other undeciphered scripts. Linear A is not politically charged. The Phaistos disk is not a matter of national identity. But the Indus script sits at the intersection of some of the most sensitive debates in South Asian politics. Debates about who the original inhabitants of the subcontinent were, what languages they spoke, and what relationship exists between the ancient civilization and the modern nations that occupy its territory. These debates have, at times, distorted the scholarly process, encouraging readings that serve political agendas rather than linguistic evidence, and making it difficult to evaluate proposed decipherments on purely scholarly grounds. The political dimension of the Indus script problem is not a minor complication. It is a structural feature of the field, a persistent pressure that shapes what gets published, what gets funded, and what gets attention. In India, proposed decipherments that support the Indo-Aryan continuity thesis. The view that the Indus civilization was a Sanskrit-speaking, Vedic culture received disproportionate media coverage and institutional support, regardless of their scholarly merits. In Pakistan, where the major Indus sites of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are located, the script is sometimes invoked in narratives of national heritage that emphasize the antiquity and distinctiveness of the land that is now Pakistan. In the Western academic world, the politics are less overt but still present. Debates about the Indus script are inevitably entangled with larger debates about the relationship between archaeology, linguistics, and the construction of cultural identity. The result is a scholarly landscape that is unusually cluttered with proposed decipherments of dubious quality. More than 100 distinct claims of decipherment have been published since the script was first discovered. The vast majority are by amateurs, cranks, or scholars working outside the relevant disciplines. But even the serious, peer-reviewed proposals, of which there are perhaps a dozen, have failed to achieve consensus. The field is characterized by a paradox. An extraordinary quantity of scholarly effort has been expended, and an extraordinarily small amount of progress has been achieved. The linguist and Indus specialist Brian Wells, who has maintained one of the most comprehensive databases of Indus sign occurrences, has described the scholarly community's frustration with characteristic directness. "We have been working on this script for almost 100 years, Wells has observed. We have more data, better methods, and more computing power than at any point in history, and we know essentially nothing more about what the inscriptions say than we did in 1925. That should tell us something. It should tell us that the problem is not one of effort or intelligence. It is a problem of missing information. The information we need does not exist in the surviving record." Requirement 3. A sufficient corpus. Even without a bilingual text or a known language, decipherment is theoretically possible if the corpus is large enough and varied enough to permit independent reconstruction of the language through internal analysis. This is how the Ugaritic alphabet was deciphered, through the analysis of internal patterns in a large corpus of texts, without any bilingual aid. But internal analysis requires long texts with enough signs to reveal grammatical patterns, word boundaries, and syntactic structures. The Indus corpus does not provide this. The inscriptions are too short. The vocabulary is too limited. The range of textual genres appears too narrow. The corpus is, for the purposes of linguistic analysis, effectively a collection of labels rather than a body of literature. The mathematician and information theorist Claude Shannon demonstrated in the 1940s that any message, to be decodable, must contain a minimum amount of information, a minimum level of redundancy that allows the receiver to distinguish signal from noise and to correct for errors and ambiguity. Short messages, by their nature, contain less redundancy than long ones. A single sentence is harder to decode than a paragraph is harder than a page, and a page is harder than a chapter. The Indus inscriptions, at an average of fewer than 5 signs each, fall far below the threshold of redundancy that would be required for systematic decipherment. They are, in Shannon's terms, too compressed, too stripped of the repetitive patterns and structural regularities that a codebreaker needs to gain a foothold. This information theoretic perspective helps to explain why computational approaches to the Indus script have achieved so little despite enormous increases in processing power. The problem is not that the computers are not powerful enough. The problem is that the data is not rich enough. Even a perfect algorithm, applied to an insufficient dataset, will produce insufficient results. The inscriptions do not contain enough information to support decipherment, regardless of the method used. More data, longer texts, more diverse genres, a bilingual inscription would change everything. But more data requires more discoveries, and the discoveries have not come. The brevity of the inscriptions is the single most devastating obstacle, and it deserves emphasis because its implications are often underestimated. Consider what you can learn about a language from a text of 5 signs. If the signs are syllabic, a 5-sign inscription represents a maximum of 5 syllables, roughly 1 or 2 words. If the signs are logographic, it represents 5 words. In either case, the inscription is too short to contain a complete sentence in most languages. It is too short to reveal verb conjugations, noun declensions, or syntactic order. It is too short to distinguish between a name, a title, an epithet, and a prayer. It is, in effect, a fragment, a shard of language so small that it could represent almost anything. But here is the problem. The question is not just what the inscriptions say. It is what kind of thing they are. Are they names, titles, clan identifiers, commercial labels, religious invocations, administrative codes? Without knowing the function of the inscriptions, scholars cannot even begin to determine what kind of language they are looking for. A name behaves differently from a prayer. A commercial label has different linguistic properties from a royal title. The function constrains the form, and the function is unknown. The most common interpretation, based on the seal format, the association with animal symbols, and the apparent commercial contexts in which many seals have been found, is that the inscriptions are identification labels. Each seal identifies its owner by name, title, clan, occupation, or some combination. This interpretation is supported by the analogy with later South Asian seal usage and by the observation that the inscriptions are roughly the right length for a personal identifier, a name plus a title, or a name plus a lineage, compressed into a few signs. If this interpretation is correct, then the Indus inscriptions are, linguistically, the least informative category of text possible. Names and titles are proper nouns. They do not conjugate. They do not decline. They do not reveal the grammar of the language in which they are expressed. You cannot reconstruct English grammar from a collection of business cards. You cannot reconstruct Indus grammar from a collection of seal impressions. The inscriptions may be writing. They may even record a language, but they may record so little of that language, such a narrow, formulaic, grammatically impoverished sliver, that no amount of analysis can extract the broader linguistic system from them, and it gets worse. There is a possibility, raised by multiple scholars and never conclusively refuted, that the Indus inscriptions do not record a single language at all. The Indus civilization covered a vast area and persisted for roughly 700 years. It is entirely possible, perhaps probable, that multiple languages were spoken within its territory. The standardization of material culture, the uniform bricks, the uniform weights, does not necessarily imply linguistic uniformity. The Roman Empire used standardized units across its territory, while dozens of languages were spoken within its borders. If the Indus script was used to write multiple languages, as cuneiform was used to write Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, and others, then the corpus is not a single puzzle, but multiple puzzles overlaid on each other, with no way to sort the pieces. The archaeologist Jonathan Mark Kenoyer, who has excavated at Harappa for over 4 decades, and who is one of the foremost authorities on the Indus civilization, has emphasized this multilingual possibility in his work. Kenoyer points out that the Indus territory encompassed regions that, in later historical periods, were home to speakers of Dravidian, Indo-Aryan, Austro-Asiatic, and possibly Tibeto-Burman languages. The likelihood that a single language was spoken across this entire territory for 700 years is, in Kenoyer's assessment, low. The Indus script may have been a multilingual administrative tool, a system of signs that could be read in different languages by different populations, much as Chinese characters can be read by speakers of Mandarin, Cantonese, and other mutually unintelligible Chinese languages. If this was the case, then the question, what language does the Indus script record, may not have a single answer. The script may record several languages simultaneously, a possibility that makes decipherment not just difficult, but potentially incoherent. This is the core problem in its full, unforgiving extent. No bilingual text, no known language, inscriptions too short for internal analysis. The function of the texts is uncertain. The number of languages represented is unknown. The question of whether the signs constitute a writing system at all is disputed. Every avenue of approach is blocked. Every assumption is contested. Every proposed reading is unfalsifiable. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The Indus civilization was not a minor backwater. It was, by the most conservative estimates, the largest urban civilization of the Bronze Age world. At its peak, it may have supported a population of 5 million people, more than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its trade networks reached from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf to the coast of Oman. Its cities were marvels of engineering. Its craft production in beadwork, metallurgy, pottery, and textile manufacture was among the finest in the ancient world, and the only direct testimony it left behind, the only record of its own voice, is a collection of inscriptions so short, so cryptic, and so resistant to analysis that the civilization remains, 5,000 years after its flourishing, essentially mute. The cities speak through their bricks. The crafts speak through their objects. The trade speaks through its artifacts. But the people, the human beings who built the cities, practiced the crafts, and conducted the trade, are silent. They left their mark on stone. The stone stares back, and the silence between the marks is the silence of a civilization that may never tell us who it was. The weight of this silence is compounded by the unique character of the Indus civilization itself. Every other major Bronze Age civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, the Mycenaean world, can be understood at least partially through its texts. We know what the pharaohs believed, what the Sumerian kings commanded, what the Shang dynasty oracle bones asked of the ancestors. We know the names of their gods, the titles of their rulers, the structure of their economies. This textual knowledge transforms a collection of ruins into a civilization, a living, breathing human world with motivations, beliefs, conflicts, and aspirations. The Indus civilization has no such transformation. It remains, for all its material splendor, a civilization of objects, a vast collection of extraordinary artifacts produced by people who are, to us, anonymous, voiceless, and fundamentally unknowable. The seal stones that bear their script are among the most beautiful small objects produced by any ancient civilization. The animals carved on their surfaces glow with life and energy. The signs inscribed above those animals are precise, confident, and clearly meaningful. But the beauty is mute, the confidence is silent, and the meaning that would connect the objects to the people, that would turn the ruins into a story, is locked behind a code that 5,000 years of intervening time may have rendered permanently unbreakable. The archaeologist Shireen Ratnagar, who has written extensively on the Indus civilization, has captured the peculiar frustration of studying a literate culture whose writing cannot be read. We are in the absurd position, Ratnagar has written, of knowing more about the drains of Mohenjo-daro than about the thoughts of the people who built them. We can measure their bricks to the millimetre. We cannot read a single word they wrote. The material record is extraordinarily complete. The intellectual record is entirely absent. We have a civilization without a mind. That mind is there, inscribed on 4,000 sealstones, pressed into clay, scratched onto pottery, stamped onto copper tablets. It has been there for 5,000 years, patient and precise, waiting for someone to understand. The question is whether understanding is possible. The evidence so far suggests that the answer is probably not. But probably is not certainly. And the difference between those two words is the space in which the entire field of Indus epigraphy continues to work. The most painful aspect of the Indus script's resistance to decipherment is not the technical difficulty, it is the human cost. Behind every seal stone inscription stands a person, a craftsman who carved the seal, a merchant who used it, a priest who offered it, an administrator who pressed it into clay. Those people had names, they had titles, they had identities, and those identities were inscribed in their own script on objects that they carried with them through their daily lives. The seal was a personal object, something worn on the body, used in transactions, pressed into wet clay to leave a mark that said, in effect, "This is mine," or "I was here," or "This is who I am." The inscriptions on the seals are, in all probability, the names of their owners. The names are there, carved into stone 5,000 years ago, perfectly preserved, perfectly legible in their physical form and perfectly incomprehensible. We are holding the business cards of the Indus civilization. We can see every mark on them. We cannot read a single name. Imagine holding in your hand a small, beautifully carved stone, warm from the display case, heavy for its size, smooth from centuries of handling. On its face, a magnificent bull with a powerful hump and wide, gentle eyes. Above the bull, a line of neat symbols, 5, perhaps 6, carved with a precision that speaks of a skilled and confident hand. Those symbols are a name, someone's name. A real person, who lived in a real city, who walked real streets, who bought and sold real goods, who prayed to real gods, someone whose identity was important enough to carve into stone. You are holding that person's name in your hand, and you cannot say it. That is the Indus Valley script. That is the unbroken code. Not a puzzle waiting for a clever solution. Not a mystery that deeper research will eventually resolve. But a silence, a 5,000-year silence, that may outlast every attempt to break it, simply because the information required to break it no longer exists in any recoverable form. The cities have spoken through their bricks. The crafts have spoken through their objects. The trade has spoken through its artifacts. But the people have not spoken. Their words are there, on 4,000 seal stones, waiting to be read. They have been waiting for 5,000 years. They may wait forever. The history of attempted decipherments of the Indus script is a history of human ingenuity, confronting an immovable wall. Each attempt has brought its own methodology, its own assumptions, and its own moments of apparent breakthrough, followed, invariably, by the cold realization that the breakthrough was illusory. What follows are 5 distinct investigations into the Indus script, each representing a different approach and each revealing a different facet of why this code remains unbroken. The first investigation is the quest to establish the direction of reading. This sounds like a trivial question. It is not. In a script that cannot be read, the direction of reading is one of the very few structural features that can be determined with any confidence. And getting it right is a prerequisite for all subsequent analysis. If the direction is wrong, every positional analysis, every study of which signs tend to begin inscriptions and which tend to end them, will be inverted, and every conclusion based on position will be false. The evidence for the direction of reading in the Indus script comes from the observation, first made by the archaeologist G.R. Hunter in the 1930s, that signs on the left side of seal inscriptions tend to be more compressed, squeezed together, as though the carver was running out of space. This is consistent with a right-to-left reading order. The carver began at the right edge, where the signs are spaciously carved, and moved leftward, gradually compressing the signs as the available space diminished. Additional evidence comes from seal impressions. The mirror image marks left when a seal is pressed into clay. When a right-to-left inscription is pressed into clay, the impression reads left to right, and the left-to-right impressions show the more spacious signs at the beginning of the text and the compressed signs at the end, which is the pattern one would expect if the text were meant to be read from left to right in its impressed form, and from right to left on the seal itself. This evidence is generally accepted as establishing a right-to-left reading direction for the seal inscriptions, but even this apparently secure conclusion has been challenged. Some scholars have argued that certain longer inscriptions, particularly those on pottery and copper tablets, may read left to right, suggesting that the direction of writing may have varied with the medium or the context. If this is the case, then the corpus contains texts written in different directions, and sorting them requires prior knowledge of the text type. Knowledge that, in the absence of decipherment, is unavailable. The direction of reading is, in the end, a solved problem, mostly. But the uncertainty at the margins illustrates a general truth about the Indus script. Even the simplest questions have complicated answers, and even the most apparently secure conclusions rest on evidence that is less robust than one would like. The history of the direction of reading debate also illustrates a methodological point that applies across the entire field of Indus studies. In the absence of readable texts, scholars must rely on physical evidence, on the spatial arrangement of signs, on the wear patterns of seals, on the orientation of impressions. to draw conclusions that would, in a deciphered script, be trivially obvious. Every conclusion requires a chain of inference. Every chain of inference is only as strong as its weakest link, and in a field where the fundamental data is so limited, the weakest links are often very weak indeed. The effort to determine the direction of reading also reveals something about the psychology of working on an undeciphered script. Scholars invest enormous effort in solving subsidiary questions: direction of reading, sign classification, frequency analysis, not because these questions are intrinsically important, but because they are solvable. They represent the frontier of what can be known in the absence of decipherment, the boundary beyond which formal analysis cannot penetrate. The central question, what do the signs mean, remains on the other side of that boundary, visible but unreachable, and so scholars work at the boundary, extending it incrementally, solving the problems they can solve, and waiting, always waiting, for the breakthrough that would render their subsidiary work meaningful by connecting it to the central question. This is not futile work. Every subsidiary conclusion constrains the space of possible decipherments, narrowing the field of plausible readings and eliminating impossible ones. If and when a breakthrough comes, a bilingual text, a language identification, a long text, the accumulated subsidiary knowledge will be essential for exploiting it. The work is, in a sense, preparation for an event that may never occur, but that, if it does, will require every scrap of knowledge that the preparatory work has produced. The second investigation is the computer-aided analysis of sign frequencies and combinatory patterns. Beginning in the 1960s with Knorozov's Soviet team and continuing through the work of Iravatham Mahadevan in India, Walter Fairservice in the United States, and the Finnish team led by Parpala, scholars have subjected the Indus corpus to increasingly sophisticated statistical analysis. The goal has been to identify patterns in how signs combine, which signs appear together, which signs appear in specific positions, which signs seem to be interchangeable, and to use these patterns to infer the structure of the writing system and, potentially, the language behind it. Iravatham Mahadevan, an Indian civil servant who devoted his retirement to the study of the Indus script, compiled the most comprehensive concordance of Indus signs ever produced, a monumental work published in 1977 that catalogued every known sign occurrence, organized by site, by object type, and by position within the inscription. Mahadevan's concordance remains the standard reference work for Indus script studies, and his analysis of sign frequencies revealed several important patterns. First, the signs show a clear positional structure. Certain signs occur predominantly at the beginning of inscriptions, others occur predominantly at the end. Still others appear only in medial positions. This positional structure is consistent with a linguistic writing system in which the position of a sign within a word or phrase is grammatically significant, as, for example, a suffix would always appear at the end of a word. Mahadevan identified a group of signs that he termed terminal signs, signs that appear overwhelmingly at the end of inscriptions and that may represent grammatical suffixes, case endings, or classifier elements. The most common terminal sign, a sign that resembles a jar or a diamond shape, appears at the end of approximately a third of all seal inscriptions. Its frequency and its consistent terminal position strongly suggest that it carries grammatical rather than lexical meaning, that it marks a syntactic boundary or a morphological category rather than representing a specific word. Second, the signs show a pattern of modification. Certain signs appear to be modified versions of other signs, a basic sign with an added stroke, an additional element, or a change in orientation. These modifications may represent phonetic variation, different sounds, semantic variation, different meanings, or grammatical variation, different forms of the same word. The existence of modifications implies that the sign system has an internal logic, a set of principles that govern how signs are formed and varied. But without knowledge of the language, the meaning of the modifications cannot be determined. Third, the signs show a pattern of clustering. Certain groups of signs appear together with a frequency that significantly exceeds what would be expected by chance. These clusters may represent fixed phrases, proper names, titles, epithets, or institutional designations that recur across the corpus. The most common cluster, a combination of three signs that Mahadevan designated as the priest-king sequence, though this label is entirely speculative, appears on dozens of seals from multiple sites. Its frequency and its wide distribution suggest that it represents something culturally significant, a common title, a widespread institution, or a frequently invoked name. But without the ability to read the signs, its significance remains a matter of conjecture. Mahadevan's work demonstrated that the Indus sign system is orderly, patterned, and internally consistent, all features that are consistent with a linguistic writing system. But it also demonstrated the limits of purely formal analysis. You can describe the patterns, you can catalogue the frequencies, you can map the positional structure, but you cannot, from formal analysis alone, determine what any of it means. The patterns are the skeleton, the meaning is the flesh, and the flesh has decomposed, leaving only bones. The work of Walter Fairservice, an American anthropologist and archaeologist who approached the Indus script from a different angle, illustrates both the promise and the peril of attempts to go beyond formal analysis. Fairservice, working in the 1980s and 90s, proposed a complete decipherment of the Indus script based on the assumption that many of the signs were pictographic, that they represented the objects they depicted, and that those objects could be matched to Dravidian vocabulary. His reading was comprehensive and internally consistent. He produced translations for hundreds of seal inscriptions, interpreting them as combinations of personal names, titles, and clan identifiers. Fairservice's decipherment was, in many ways, the most complete and systematic ever proposed for the Indus script. It was also rejected by the majority of specialists in the field, who pointed out that his readings depended on a chain of assumptions about the pictographic nature of the signs, about the Dravidian identity of the language, and about the stability of Dravidian vocabulary over 4,000 years that could not be independently verified. The readings were internally consistent because any system of readings can be made internally consistent if the reader has enough freedom to adjust the interpretations. The question was whether they were correct, and without external verification, without a bilingual text, a related script, or an independent body of evidence against which to test the readings, correctness could not be determined. Fairservice died in 1994 without having convinced the scholarly community. His work remains the most detailed individual attempt at a complete decipherment, and it is still cited by scholars who favour the Dravidian hypothesis. But it is cited as a hypothesis, not as a demonstrated result. The distinction is crucial. In epigraphy, a proposed reading that cannot be verified is not a decipherment. It is a guess, an educated, carefully reasoned, systematically constructed guess, but a guess nonetheless. The third investigation takes us from statistics to archaeology, and from the seal stones to a different category of inscribed object, the so-called signboards. At the site of Dholavira, a large Harappan city in the Rann of Kutch in Gujarat, the archaeologist R.S. Bisht discovered, during excavations in the 1990s, a remarkable set of inscribed objects. In the gateway of the city's northern citadel, he found a series of large letters, not carved into stone but inlaid into a wooden signboard, using a material that has been interpreted as white gypsum or shell, set into a dark wooden backing. The letters were large, each approximately 37 centimeters tall, and they spelled out an inscription of 10 signs. The signboard had collapsed when its wooden backing decayed, but the individual inlaid letters were preserved in their original positions in the archaeological deposit, allowing the inscription to be reconstructed. The Dholavira signboard is unique in the Indus corpus. It is the only known example of a monumental inscription, a text displayed publicly, at a significant architectural location, at a scale intended to be read from a distance. Every other Indus inscription is small, carved on seal stones, scratched onto pottery, incised into copper tablets. The signboard suggests that the Indus script was used not just for personal identification and administrative record-keeping, but also for public communication, for messages intended to be seen and read by anyone approaching the citadel gate. What did the signboard say? The most common interpretation is that it bore the name of the city, a toponym, a place name displayed at the entrance as an identification marker. Other scholars have suggested it might be a royal or institutional name, a dedicatory inscription, or a declaration of some kind. The 10 signs of the Dholavira inscription are among the most intensively analysed in the entire corpus. Multiple proposed readings have been advanced. None has achieved consensus. The signboard is significant not for what it says, which remains unknown, but for what it implies about the role of literacy in Indus society. A monumental inscription, displayed at a city gate, implies an audience, a population that could read, or at least recognise, the signs displayed before them. It implies that literacy was not confined to scribes and administrators, but extended to at least some portion of the general public. And it implies that the Indus script served communicative functions beyond the narrow administrative and identificatory roles suggested by the seal stones alone. The civilization was not merely using writing for bookkeeping. It was using writing for public address. This deepens the tragedy of the undecipherment. The Indus people were not secretive about their script. They displayed it publicly, at monumental scale, at the entrances to their cities. They wanted their words to be seen. They expected their signs to be understood. 5,000 years later, the signs are still visible. The Dholavira letters are among the largest and most dramatic artifacts of the Indus civilization, and they are still not understood. The Dholavira signboard also raises a question about the relationship between the seal inscriptions and other categories of Indus writing. If the seals are personal identification labels, business cards, essentially, and the signboard is a public inscription, a city name or institutional title, then the Indus script served at least 2 distinct communicative functions. Were there others? The evidence suggests yes. In addition to the seal stones and the Dholavira signboard, Indus script signs have been found on pottery, on copper tablets, on ivory rods, on bronze implements, and on miniature tablets made of various materials. Each category of object represents a potentially different genre of writing, with different conventions, different vocabulary, and different communicative purposes. The copper tablets are particularly intriguing. Roughly 100 of these small, flat pieces of copper have been found, most at the site of Mohenjo-daro. They bear inscriptions that are, on average, slightly longer than the seal inscriptions. Some contain 10 or more signs, and they are often inscribed on both sides, suggesting that they carry more information than a simple identification label. The images on the copper tablets are also different from those on the seals. Where the seals typically show a single animal, the copper tablets often depict scenes, multiple figures, apparent narrative elements, or symbolic compositions that suggest ritual or mythological content. If the copper tablets represent a different genre of text from the seals, if they are religious texts, administrative orders, or narrative documents rather than personal identifiers, then they might contain the kind of longer, more varied text that decipherment requires. But the tablets are few in number, poorly preserved, and their inscriptions remain as opaque as those on the seals. They represent a tantalizing possibility, a second window into the Indus script, slightly wider than the first. But the view through that window is no clearer. The ivory and bone implements, found at several sites, bear inscribed signs that may represent yet another category of text. Some of these objects appear to be measuring instruments, graduated rods that may have served as rulers or calibration tools. The inscriptions on these objects might be labels, scales, or instructions. If they are labels for specific measurements or quantities, they might provide a way to connect Indus signs to concrete meanings, to establish that a particular sign represents a particular unit of measurement, for example. But the number of inscribed measuring instruments is tiny. Fewer than a dozen are known, and the inscriptions on them are too few and too short to support systematic analysis. The diversity of inscribed objects in the Indus corpus is paradoxically both a source of hope and a source of frustration. Hope, because it demonstrates that the Indus script was used for multiple purposes across multiple media, suggesting a society in which writing played a broad and varied role. Frustration, because each new category of inscribed object adds to the diversity of the corpus without adding the kind of length and variability that decipherment requires. More categories of text do not help if all the categories are equally brief. The fourth investigation concerns the most controversial aspect of the Indus script, the question of whether it is writing at all. The Farmer-Sproat-Witzel thesis, introduced earlier, argued that the Indus signs are non-linguistic symbols rather than writing. The thesis was based on several observations: the extreme brevity of the inscriptions, the absence of long texts, and the claimed absence of the kind of statistical patterns that characterize linguistic writing. But the strongest version of the argument rested on a comparative point: that many ancient and modern cultures have used elaborate systems of non-linguistic symbols for purposes of identification, ritual marking, and social signaling, and that the Indus signs could be explained as such a system without recourse to the assumption of language. The response from the field was, as noted earlier, largely critical, but the debate forced a level of methodological rigor that has been, in retrospect, beneficial. Scholars who had previously taken for granted that the Indus signs were writing were compelled to articulate and to defend the specific evidence on which that assumption rested. The result was a sharpening of the debate and a clarification of the criteria by which the question should be judged. The most compelling evidence for the linguistic interpretation comes from several independent lines of analysis. First, the sign system contains approximately 400 distinct signs, too many for an alphabet, too few for a purely logographic system, and consistent with a logosyllabic writing system in which some signs represent whole words and others represent syllables or phonetic elements. Second, the signs show positional constraints. They do not appear randomly, but in specific, statistically significant positions within inscriptions, consistent with a system that encodes grammatical structure. Third, the signs show evidence of modification, basic signs altered by the addition of strokes, dots, or other elements, consistent with a system that distinguishes between related but different linguistic units. Fourth, the sign sequences show conditional entropy values, a measure of the predictability of one sign given the preceding sign, that fall within the range observed for known linguistic writing systems and outside the range observed for non-linguistic symbol systems. None of these arguments is individually decisive. A non-linguistic symbol system could, in principle, exhibit some or all of these features, but the combination of all four, the right number of signs, the right positional structure, the right modification patterns, and the right statistical profile, constitutes, in the judgment of the majority of scholars, a strong cumulative case for the linguistic interpretation. The Indus signs are almost certainly writing, but almost certainly is not certainly, and the margin of uncertainty is large enough to sustain a genuine debate. The fifth investigation is the most recent and the most technologically ambitious: the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence to the Indus corpus. In the past decade, several research teams have applied deep learning algorithms to the Indus sign system, seeking patterns that traditional analysis might miss. The most prominent of these efforts is the ongoing work of Rajesh Rao and his colleagues at the University of Washington, who have used recurrent neural networks to model the sequential structure of Indus sign sequence. Their algorithm learned to predict the next sign in a sequence based on the preceding signs, a task that requires the model to internalize the statistical regularities of the sign system. The model achieved prediction accuracies significantly above chance, confirming that the sign sequences are highly ordered, and that they obey rules of combination that are complex enough to require a sophisticated statistical model to capture. But prediction is not decipherment. The model can predict which sign is likely to come next. It cannot say what the sign means. It is, in a sense, a very sophisticated apparat, able to mimic the patterns of the script without understanding the language behind them. The AI can generate plausible Indus sign sequences. It cannot tell you what those sequences say. The technology has confirmed what human analysis had already established, that the Indus signs are structured, ordered, and rule-governed, but it has not bridged the gap between structure and meaning. That gap requires not more computing power, but more data, specifically, data of a kind that does not exist: a bilingual text, a related language, or a corpus of sufficient length and variety to permit independent linguistic reconstruction. Rao's team has also explored the use of Markov models, statistical models that predict the probability of each sign based on the preceding signs, to compare the Indus script's statistical profile with those of known writing systems and known non-linguistic symbol systems. The Markov analysis showed that the Indus sign sequences have a level of regularity, measured by conditional entropy, that falls between the highly ordered patterns of rigid symbolic codes, like DNA or musical notation, and the more flexible patterns of natural languages. The Indus script's conditional entropy was closest to that of Sumerian cuneiform, a known logosyllabic writing system. This finding was presented as evidence that the Indus signs encode language, but the interpretation was immediately challenged. Richard Sproat, a computational linguist at the Oregon Health and Science University, argued that the conditional entropy analysis was too crude to distinguish between linguistic and non-linguistic systems. He demonstrated that certain non-linguistic symbol sequences, including sequences of Fortran computer code and medieval heraldic blazons, produced conditional entropy values similar to those of natural languages. The Markov model, Sproat contended, was measuring the degree of sequential structure in the sign system, not the presence of linguistic content. Many systems are structured without being linguistic. The conditional entropy analysis could not distinguish between them. The debate between Rao and Sproat has continued for over a decade, with each side refining its methodology and each claiming to have answered the other's objections. The technical details are arcane, but the underlying issue is simple. Can statistical analysis alone determine whether a set of signs encodes language? Rao says yes, with caveats. Sproat says no, with conviction. The field has not resolved the disagreement, and the consequence is that the most basic question about the Indus signs, are they writing, remains, in the strict methodological sense, open. This openness is not a source of comfort, it is a source of paralysis. If scholars cannot agree on whether the signs are writing, they cannot agree on how to proceed. If the signs are writing, then the appropriate methodology is linguistic decipherment. If the signs are non-linguistic symbols, then the appropriate methodology is iconographic or semiotic analysis. The two approaches are fundamentally different, and applying the wrong one guarantees failure. The inability to resolve the writing versus symbols debate is not a minor procedural issue. It is a fork in the road, and the field has been standing at the fork for nearly 2 decades, unable to choose a path. The math is striking. Researchers estimate that a corpus of at least 50,000 continuous sign tokens, or organized in texts of at least 20 to 30 signs each, would be the minimum required for a reasonable attempt at internal decipherment. The current corpus contains approximately 26,000 sign tokens, distributed across thousands of inscriptions, averaging fewer than 5 signs each. The quantity is borderline. The distribution is catastrophic. Even if the total number of sign tokens were doubled by new discoveries, the brevity of the individual inscriptions would continue to prevent the kind of analysis that decipherment requires. These 5 investigations, the direction of reading, the statistical analysis of sign patterns, the Dholavira signboard, the writing versus symbols debate, and the AI analysis, share a common lesson. In each case, significant intellectual effort has been invested. In each case, real progress has been made on specific subsidiary questions. And in each case, the central question, what do the inscriptions say, remains unanswered. The subsidiary questions are being resolved. The primary question is not, and the reason is always the same. The information required to answer the primary question is not contained in the evidence that has survived. This conclusion, reached independently by multiple scholars using different methodologies, carries a weight that is difficult to exaggerate. 100 years of work by some of the most talented scholars in the world, equipped with some of the most powerful analytical tools in history, has not produced a single confirmed reading of a single Indus sign. Not one. The contrast with other undeciphered scripts is instructive. Linear A, despite being undeciphered, has yielded at least a few words whose meanings can be established with reasonable confidence. Kuro for total, the approximate sound values of many signs. Proto-Elamite, while largely unread, has revealed the structure of its numeral system and the general categories of its administrative vocabulary. Even the Phaistos disc, that most intractable of epigraphic puzzles, has yielded to the extent that its sign inventory has been catalogued and its structural features analyzed. The Indus script has resisted even these modest levels of progress. No individual sign's meaning has been established beyond reasonable dispute. No word has been identified with confidence. No grammatical feature has been demonstrated. The script sits at the extreme end of the spectrum of undecipherability, the point at which the evidence is too limited, the language too unknown, and the inscriptions too short for any current methodology to gain traction. The archaeologist and epigrapher John Chadwick, the man who collaborated with Michael Ventris on the decipherment of Linear B, and who spent his career surrounded by the successes and failures of ancient script decipherment, once remarked that the Indus script represented the most intractable problem in the whole field of epigraphy. Coming from a man who had cracked one of the great puzzles of the 20th century, this judgment carries particular authority. Chadwick understood, from direct experience, what makes a script decipherable, and he concluded that the Indus script lacked every necessary ingredient. Whether future discoveries will change this assessment is unknown. The ground has not yet yielded all its secrets, but it has yielded a great deal. A century's worth of excavation across hundreds of sites, and it has not yielded the one thing that decipherment requires. The bilingual text has not appeared. The long inscription has not been found. The related language has not been identified. The field waits, with diminishing hope and enduring dedication, for the accent of discovery that would change everything. There is a painful irony in the fact that the Indus civilization, which was, by any measure, one of the most organized and systematic cultures of the ancient world, left behind a record that defies systematic analysis. A civilization that standardized its bricks to a uniform ratio across 1,000,000 square kilometers produced inscriptions too short and too varied to yield to statistical methods. A civilization that maintained a uniform system of weights across hundreds of settlements could not maintain the linguistic continuity that would have preserved its voice across the centuries. The standardization that is the hallmark of the Indus civilization, its greatest achievement and its most distinctive characteristic, did not extend to the preservation of its own meaning. The bricks are standard, the weights are standard, the urban plans are standard. The script is standard, but the language that gave the script its meaning was not standardized against the passage of time. It could not be. No language can be. Languages are living things, and living things change, and change, over enough time, is indistinguishable from death. The 5 investigations examined here, the direction of reading, the statistical analysis, the Dholavira signboard, the writing versus symbols debate, and the AI analysis, represent the best efforts of a century of scholarship. They have produced genuine knowledge about the structure, distribution, and statistical properties of the Indus sign system. They have not produced a single readable word. The gap between what we know about the script and what we need to know to read it is not a gap that more of the same kind of work can close. It is a gap that requires a fundamentally different kind of evidence that the archaeological record has not provided and may never provide. The seal stones wait, the scholars work, the code endures, and the silence, patient and absolute, shows no sign of breaking. There is a moment, late at night, in a museum storage room, when you hold an Indus seal stone in your hand and feel the weight of what you do not know. The stone is cool, the carving is crisp. The bull on the face stares at you with an eye that was cut 5,000 years ago by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. Above the bull, the signs march in their neat row. 5 symbols, each one distinct, each one perfectly formed, each one carrying a meaning that the carver knew and you do not. You are holding a message, a real message, from a real person intended to convey real information. The information is right there, encoded in the signs, preserved in stone, surviving every earthquake and every flood and every empire that has risen and fallen in the intervening millennia. The stone has done its job. It has carried the message across 5,000 years of time, and now it has reached you, the reader, the intended endpoint of the communicative act that began when a Harappan craftsman pressed his stylus into soft soapstone in a workshop in Mohenjo-daro or Harappa or Dholavira, and you cannot read it. Let that sink in. The deeper truth of the Indus Valley script is not about linguistics or epigraphy or computational analysis. It is about the nature of communication across time, about the fragility of the chain that connects a writer to a reader, a sender to a receiver, a past to a future. Communication requires a shared code. The Indus scribes had a code, their contemporaries shared it. We do not. And the gap between their code and our understanding is not a gap that can be bridged by intelligence alone. It requires information. Specific, concrete, irreplaceable information about the relationship between the signs and the sounds, between the script and the language, between the marks on the stone and the meaning in the mind. That information has been lost. Not misplaced, not hidden. Lost. Dissolved into the entropy of 5,000 years. Carried away by the same rivers that eroded the cities. The philosopher Jacques Derrida wrote about what he called the absence at the heart of all writing. The fact that writing, unlike speech, functions in the absence of its author. The writer is not present when the text is read. The text must carry its meaning alone, without the writer's voice, gesture, or presence to clarify and support it. For most writing, this absence is bridged by a shared language. The reader and writer both speak English or both speak Mandarin, and the shared language provides the context that the absent writer cannot. For the Indus script, the shared language is itself absent. The writer is absent, the language is absent, and the text, stripped of both its author and its linguistic context, becomes pure form, marks on stone, beautiful and meaningless, a message without a medium. This is not science fiction. This is the reality of the Indus script, and it may be the reality of any writing system whose language dies without leaving descendants or relatives. The Indus script is not unique in its undecipherability. It shares its fate with Proto-Elamite, with Rongorongo, with the Cypro-Minoan script, and with dozens of other ancient writing systems that record unknown languages. But the Indus script is unique in its scale, in the size of the civilization that produced it, in the number of inscribed objects that survive, and in the intensity of the scholarly effort that has been devoted to its decipherment. The Indus script is the greatest unsolved puzzle in the history of human writing, and it may remain unsolved forever. The implications extend far beyond the Indus civilization itself. If the Indus script cannot be deciphered, then one of the foundational civilizations of human history will remain permanently voiceless. A civilization known only through its objects, never through its words. This is not merely an academic loss, it is a human loss. It means that the people who built Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, people who were, by every available measure, as intelligent, as creative, and as culturally rich as any people who have ever lived, will be remembered only for their bricks and their drains, never for their thoughts and their beliefs. Their inner life will be permanently inaccessible. Their humanity will be reduced to archaeology. There is an ongoing excavation at the site of Rakhigarhi in the Indian state of Haryana that has been described by its director, Vasant Shinde, as the most promising current source of new Indus Valley material. Rakhigarhi is one of the largest Harappan sites, possibly the largest, and its excavation has produced new inscribed objects, new seal stones, and new material contexts that add incrementally to the corpus. But the additions are incremental, not transformative. More seal stones with short inscriptions, more pottery with scattered signs, more of the same kind of evidence that scholars have been analysing for a century, in the same frustrating quantities and the same tantalisingly brief formats. The hope that a long text, a clay tablet, a pottery vessel, a stone slab with an inscription of 100 signs or more, might turn up at Rakhigarhi or at another Indus site is not unreasonable. Long inscriptions in the Indus script may exist, buried under meters of alluvial silt, waiting for an excavator's trowel. The cities of the Indus Valley are vast, and only a fraction of their area has been excavated. Mohenjo-daro, the most extensively explored Indus site, has had less than 10% of its total area excavated. The remaining 90% is unexcavated territory, a repository of undiscovered objects, undiscovered buildings, and potentially undiscovered inscriptions. The same is true of Harappa, Dholavira, Ganweriwala, and dozens of smaller sites. But the hope must be tempered by the physical reality of the Indus Valley's climate and hydrology. The alluvial plains of the Indus and its tributaries are among the most geologically active landscapes on Earth. Rivers shift their courses. Floods deposit meters of new sediment. The water table, which has risen significantly since the Harappan period, has submerged the lower levels of many sites, the levels that would contain the earliest and potentially most informative deposits, beneath water that makes excavation extremely difficult. At Mohenjo-daro, the lowest levels of the site are waterlogged, and pumping operations have been required to access them. The conditions that would preserve a long clay tablet, a dry sealed context, protected from water, are precisely the conditions that the Indus Valley's active hydrology makes least likely to provide. The archaeologist Gregory Possehl, who spent decades studying the Indus civilization before his death in 2011, was forthright about the prospects. "We have been excavating in the Indus Valley for 100 years, Possehl observed. "We have not found a long text. We have not found a bilingual inscription. We have not found a library, an archive, or a scribal school. At some point, we have to consider the possibility that these things do not exist, that they were written on materials that have not survived, or that they were never produced. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but 100 years of absence is a pattern. The contrast with other ancient civilizations makes the loss more vivid. We know the Egyptian pharaohs by name. We know what they believed about death, about the afterlife, about the gods. We know because they told us. In hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover the walls of their tombs, on papyri that preserve their myths and rituals, in texts that record their prayers and their fears. We know the Mesopotamian kings in the same way, through the cuneiform tablets that preserve their law codes, their diplomatic correspondence, their literary epics. We know these civilizations as human civilizations. Civilizations of people with names, beliefs, stories, and inner lives. We do not know the Indus civilization in this way. We know it as a civilization of objects, of bricks, of beads, of drains, of seals. We know what they built. We do not know what they thought. We know how they lived. We do not know why. The script, sitting on its seal stones, is the bridge that would connect the objects to the people, the material to the mental, the archaeological record to the human record. And the bridge is broken. What makes the Indus case uniquely painful among the world's undeciphered scripts is the nature of the civilization itself. The Indus civilization was not just big, it was different. Different from every other major Bronze Age civilization, in ways that challenge our basic assumptions about how complex societies work. It had no visible military apparatus, no weapons caches, no fortifications designed for defense against armies, no depictions of warfare in its art. It had no visible political hierarchy, no palaces, no throne rooms, no iconography of rulership. It had no monumental religious architecture, no temples on the scale of Egyptian or Mesopotamian buildings. And yet it functioned, for 700 years, across 1 million square kilometers. With a population in the millions, it maintained a level of cultural uniformity and urban sophistication that implies coordination on a massive scale. How? How does a civilization of this size and complexity function without the visible apparatus of state power? How does it maintain standardized weights across 1,000 kilometers without a central authority to enforce the standard? How does it build cities with identical urban plans without a royal decree mandating the plan? These are not idle questions. They are among the most important questions in the history of political organization. If the Indus civilization achieved what it appears to have achieved, complex social coordination without authoritarian control, then it offers a model of governance that has no parallel in the ancient world, and that might have profound implications for how we think about the relationship between complexity and authority. The script might answer these questions. It might reveal a form of governance that the archaeological record cannot detect, a system of councils, of rotating leadership, of consensual decision-making, of religious or commercial authority that operated without the trappings of kingship. Or it might reveal the opposite, a powerful ruling class that simply chose not to express its power through the monumental self-glorification that characterizes other ancient elites. Either answer would be transformative, and either answer is locked behind the undeciphered signs on 4,000 seal stones. The archaeologist Adam Green, working at the site of Masudpur in Haryana, has argued that the absence of visible hierarchy in the Indus civilization may itself be meaningful, that it may reflect not an absence of power, but a different relationship to power, in which authority was expressed through the management of infrastructure and the maintenance of standards, rather than through the construction of palaces and the display of military force. Green's argument is compelling but speculative. It infers political organization from material culture in the absence of textual evidence. With the script, the inference could be confirmed or refuted. Without the script, it remains a hypothesis. And the most unsettling part, we may be doing the same thing right now, not with scripts, but with entire digital ecosystems. Our civilization stores its knowledge in formats that become obsolete within decades. Software that was current 20 years ago is often unreadable today. File formats, encoding standards, and storage media change so rapidly that the digital record is, in many ways, more fragile than the clay tablets of the ancient world. The Indus seal stones have survived 5,000 years. A compact disc lasts roughly 25. A hard drive lasts 5. The clay endures, the silicon degrades, and the meaning, in both cases, depends on the survival of the code. The shared understanding between writer and reader that allows marks to become words. The Indus scribes carved their signs into stone because stone endures. They were right. The signs have endured. But endurance of the medium does not guarantee survival of the message. The message requires not just a durable medium, but a living code, a shared language, maintained by a community of speakers, transmitted from generation to generation without interruption. When the community dies, the code dies. When the code dies, the message dies. And the stone, which has done everything it was asked to do, which has carried the marks faithfully across millennia of time, becomes a monument not to communication, but to its failure. There is a thought experiment that illuminates the depth of this problem. Imagine that a catastrophe struck the modern world, not a total extinction, but a disruption severe enough to break the chain of linguistic continuity. Imagine that the English language, after such a catastrophe, evolved into something unrecognizable within a few centuries, as Latin evolved into Italian and French and Spanish, but faster and more completely. Imagine that, 1,000 years later, archaeologists of this future civilization excavated the ruins of a modern city and found, among the rubble, a USB drive. They would have the physical object. They could examine it under a microscope, analyze its chemical composition, map its internal structure. They could determine that it was a manufactured object, designed to store information. But without a computer to read it, without software to decode its file system, without knowledge of the language in which its contents were written, they could do nothing. The drive would be an artifact. The information it contained would be lost. The Indus seal stones are the USB drives of the Bronze Age. They are storage devices, objects designed to carry information through time. They have survived the equivalent of a civilizational power failure. The hardware is intact, the software is gone, and without the software, without the shared language that gives the signs their meaning, the hardware is beautiful, fascinating, and mute. The scale of the human loss embedded in this technical failure is difficult to overstate. The Indus civilization lasted for roughly 700 years in its mature phase. During that time, millions of people were born, lived, loved, worked, prayed, suffered, celebrated, and died within its territory. They had names, they had families, they had beliefs, they had stories. Stories about how the world began, about why the rains came, about what happened after death, about the heroes and tricksters and gods that populated their imaginative world. They had a language in which to tell those stories, and they had a script in which to write them down. All of that, every name, every story, every prayer, every belief, is sealed behind the undeciphered script. The people themselves are not lost. Their bones lie in the cemeteries of Harappa and Kalibangan, studied by physical anthropologists who can tell us their age, their diet, their diseases, and the physical stresses of their daily labor. Their DNA is being sequenced by geneticists who are mapping the population history of the subcontinent with increasing precision. Their objects fill museum cases across the world, studied by archaeologists who can reconstruct their trade networks, their manufacturing techniques, and their artistic traditions. The physical Indus people are known. The mental Indus people, the people who thought and spoke and believed and argued, are unknown, and they will remain unknown until the script is read, or until we accept that it may never be. The Indus Valley Civilization occupies a unique position among the world's great ancient cultures. The position of a civilization that is simultaneously known and unknown, present and absent, visible and voiceless. We can walk its streets. We cannot hear its conversations. We can touch its bricks. We cannot read its thoughts. We can admire its art. We cannot understand its stories. The civilization is physically present in the archaeological record with a completeness that rivals Egypt or Mesopotamia. It is intellectually absent with a totality that has no parallel among civilizations of comparable scale and sophistication. This dual status, simultaneously the best preserved and the least understood major civilization of the ancient world, gives the Indus script a significance that extends beyond the concerns of epigraphy or archaeology. The script is a test case for one of the most fundamental assumptions of human civilization, the assumption that what is written can be read. We build our institutions, our legal systems, our religious traditions, and our intellectual heritage on this assumption. We write constitutions because we believe they will be read. We sign treaties because we believe they will be understood. We carve memorial inscriptions because we believe they will communicate across time. The Indus script challenges this assumption at its root. It was written to be read. It was carefully inscribed by skilled craftspeople on durable materials designed to endure, and it cannot be read. Not because the materials failed, not because the inscriptions are damaged, but because the shared understanding between writer and reader, the lingua franca, the common code, the mutual comprehension that makes writing meaningful, has been destroyed by the passage of time. The destruction was not deliberate. No one chose to silence the Indus voice. No conqueror burned their libraries. No iconoclast smashed their tablets. The silence was a natural consequence of linguistic change, the slow, impersonal, utterly inevitable process by which languages evolve, diverge, and die. The language of the Indus people changed. It changed until it was no longer recognizable as the language of the Indus people. And when the last link between the old language and the new one dissolved, the inscriptions became what they are now. Marks without meaning, form without content, the physical residue of a communicative act that can never be completed. Let that sink in. The Indus Valley Civilization built cities that would not be equaled in South Asia for 2,000 years. It maintained standards of urban planning that modern cities struggle to match. It conducted trade across distances that spanned half a continent. It produced art of exquisite beauty and craft of extraordinary precision. It invented a writing system, one of only a handful of independent inventions of writing in all of human history. And it left behind a record that we cannot read, a voice that we cannot hear, a message that has survived everything except its own comprehension. The seal stones wait. They have been waiting for 5,000 years. They will wait as long as the stone endures, which is, for all practical purposes, forever. The signs on their faces are as sharp as they were the day they were carved. The animals below the signs still breathe with the life that the carver gave them. The bull still turns its great head. The rhinoceros still lowers its horn. The elephant still lifts its trunk. The unicorn still stands beside its mysterious object, patient and watchful, guarding a secret that no one alive can reveal. The code is unbroken, the civilization is unheard, and the silence that fills the space between the carved signs, the silence where meaning should be, is the oldest, deepest, and most complete silence in the history of human writing. There is one final dimension to this silence that demands attention. The Indus civilization challenges not just our ability to read ancient scripts, but our ability to imagine alternative forms of human social organization. Every other documented major Bronze Age civilization reveals a familiar pattern: centralized authority, expressed through monumental architecture, enforced through military power, and legitimated through religious ideology. The pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of Mesopotamia, the Shang dynasty rulers of China, all operated within this framework. Their texts tell us about their power, their wars, their gods, and their laws. Their buildings announce their authority. The pattern is so consistent that it has come to seem inevitable, as though centralized, hierarchical authority is the only possible response to the challenges of managing a large, complex society. The Indus civilization appears to contradict this assumption. Its material record shows no evidence of the familiar pattern. No palaces, no war art, no monumental tombs, no glorifying inscriptions. If the archaeological evidence is read at face value, the Indus civilization achieved social complexity and cultural uniformity that, in every other known case, required centralized authority, and it did so without it. This is, if true, one of the most significant discoveries in the history of political thought. It suggests that there are alternative pathways to social complexity, pathways that do not require kings, armies, or coercive hierarchies. But the crucial qualifier is, if true. Without the script, we cannot confirm or deny the absence of centralized authority. The material record, without textual support, is ambiguous. The script would resolve the ambiguity. It would tell us whether the Indus civilization was organized as the material record suggests, cooperatively, without coercive hierarchy, or whether a more conventional political structure lurked behind the egalitarian facade. The answer matters enormously, not just for our understanding of the ancient world, but for our understanding of what is possible in the organization of human societies. And the answer is locked behind a code that 100 years of effort have failed to break. What does it mean for one of the foundational civilizations of human history to remain permanently voiceless? The question is not rhetorical. It has consequences, intellectual, cultural, and philosophical, that extend far beyond the narrow confines of epigraphy and Bronze Age archaeology. The journey of this story has taken us from a railway construction site in colonial India to the cutting edge of computational linguistics, and the conclusion we have arrived at is as uncomfortable as it is unavoidable. The Indus Valley script may be permanently undecipherable. The evidence for this conclusion is not a single failure, but an accumulation of failures. A century of sustained scholarly effort that has produced significant subsidiary results, but no progress on the central question. The sign system has been catalogued. The positional patterns have been mapped. The statistical structure has been analyzed. The computational models have been trained. And the inscriptions remain as opaque as they were on the day of their discovery. This does not mean that the effort has been wasted. It means that the effort has revealed the shape of the problem, and the shape is discouraging. The problem is not a wall that can be climbed with enough effort. It is an absence of the specific information that decipherment requires. More effort cannot fill the absence. More computing power cannot manufacture missing data. The problem is structural, not tactical, and the only structural solution, the discovery of a bilingual text, a related language, or a sufficiently long corpus, depends on forces beyond the control of scholarship. The accidents of archaeology, the vagaries of preservation, the blind luck of discovery, the implications for how we think about the ancient world are profound. We are accustomed to understanding ancient civilizations through their texts. Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Greece, Rome, these are civilizations whose inner lives are accessible because their writing can be read. Our understanding of them is not limited to their architecture and their artifacts. We know what they thought, what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped. This textual access is so deeply embedded in our approach to the ancient world that we often forget how exceptional it is. The Indus civilization is a reminder that textual access is not the norm. It is a luxury that depends on a chain of contingencies: the invention of writing, the use of durable media, the survival of sufficient text, the continuity of the language, and the availability of a decipherment key. Break any link in that chain, and the civilization falls silent. The Indus civilization broke nearly every link. Its writing survives, but only on small, brief, formulaic inscriptions. Its language does not survive, in any recognizable form. No bilingual key exists. No related script provides a bridge. The chain is not merely broken, it is shattered. And this shattering is not unique to the Indus. It is the fate of the vast majority of human civilizations. Of the thousands of cultures that have existed in human history, only a tiny fraction left written records, and only a fraction of those records can be read. The civilizations we know through their texts, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, are the exceptions, not the rule. They are the survivors of a ruthless process of selection, in which the default outcome is silence, and the preservation of voice requires a combination of fortunate circumstances that most civilizations did not enjoy. The Indus civilization did not enjoy them. It was one of the most sophisticated societies of the ancient world, a society that invented writing, that built cities, that maintained trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers, and it is silent. Not because it lacked the capacity for expression, not because it had nothing to say, but because the specific chain of circumstances required to carry its voice across 5,000 years of time did not hold. The stone survived, the script survived, the language did not, and without the language, the voice is lost. Are we making the same mistakes? The parallel with the modern world is uncomfortable but unavoidable. We store our knowledge in digital formats that become obsolete within years. We depend on institutional structures to maintain our archives, and institutions are subject to the same economic and political disruptions that brought down ancient civilizations. We assume that our knowledge is permanent because it is abundant, but the Indus civilization teaches us that abundance of inscription does not guarantee survival of meaning. 4,000 inscribed objects survived from the Indus civilization. Not one can be read. How many of our own inscriptions, our emails, our texts, our social media posts, our digital archives will be readable in 5,000 years? The answer is sobering. In 5,000 years, the physical media on which our digital records are stored will have disintegrated. The formats in which they are encoded will have been obsolete for millennia. The institutions that maintain them will be distant memories. The languages in which they are written may have evolved beyond recognition. Our civilization's voice, so loud, so ubiquitous, so confident, may be as silent in 5,000 years as the Indus civilization's voice is today. The Indus seal stones, sitting in their museum cases, are a warning. They say, this is what happens when the chain breaks. This is what silence looks like. This is what it means for a civilization to speak and not be heard. The warning is not abstract. It is concrete, specific, and applicable to the present moment. Consider the indigenous languages of the world, the approximately 7,000 languages currently spoken by human beings, of which roughly half are expected to die within this century. Each one is a code, a shared system of meaning, maintained by a community of speakers, transmitted from generation to generation through the ordinary processes of family life and social interaction. Each one carries knowledge about local environments, about medicinal plants, about agricultural techniques, about social organization, about the natural and spiritual worlds that exists in no other language. When a language dies, that knowledge dies with it. The code breaks, the message is lost, and no technology, no archive, no digital recording can fully replace the living chain of speakers who carried it. The Indus script is a monument to what happens when that chain is broken on a civilizational scale. It is not the only such monument. Linear A, the Indus script, Proto-Elamite, Rongorongo, the Cypro-Minoan script. Each one is a voice that spoke and was silenced, a code that was shared and is now exclusive to no one, a message that was sent and was never received. Together, they constitute a chorus of silence, a reminder that the default condition of human knowledge is not preservation but loss, and that the burden of proof lies not with those who claim that knowledge is fragile, but with those who claim that it is permanent. The bricks of Mohenjo-daro will stand for centuries yet. The seal stones will endure for millennia. But the words that the bricks and stones were built to serve, are gone. The medium outlasts the message. The form outlasts the content. The carrier outlasts the cargo. And the civilization that sent the message stands mute in the archaeological record, surrounded by the evidence of its own eloquence, waiting for a reader who may never come. In a storage room in the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi, there is a drawer that contains several hundred Indus seal stones. They are arranged in rows, each one nestled in a padded compartment, each one labelled with a catalogue number and a site of origin. Most are smaller than a postage stamp. All are carved with the same extraordinary precision, the same crisp lines, the same confident symbols, the same patient animals gazing from their stone surfaces with expressions that seem, across the distance of 5 millennia, to contain something approaching awareness. The answer to the question posed by the title of this documentary is not the answer that anyone wanted. The Indus Valley script is an unbroken code, not because we have not tried to break it, but because the information required to break it does not appear to exist. No bilingual text has been found. No related language has been identified. The inscriptions are too short and too formulaic for internal linguistic reconstruction. The language behind the script is unknown, unrelated to any identified language family, and unsupported by any external evidence that could provide a starting point for decipherment. This is not a failure of intelligence. The scholars who have worked on the Indus script, Parpola, Mahadevan, Knorozov, Fairservice, Rao Wells, and dozens of others, are among the most brilliant minds ever to apply themselves to a problem of ancient writing. They have brought to bear every tool available to modern scholarship: statistical analysis, computational modeling, comparative linguistics, archaeological contextualization, and artificial intelligence. They have worked with dedication, with rigor, and with a passion for understanding that does them immense credit. And they have failed, not because they were inadequate to the task, but because the task itself may be impossible, because the information that would make it possible is no longer available in any form that human effort can recover. The Indus Valley Civilization is the largest voiceless civilization in human history. It covered more territory than Egypt. It lasted longer than most European nations have existed. It supported a population in the millions. It built cities that were not surpassed in the region for 2,000 years. It invented a writing system that is one of the rarest achievements of the human mind, an independent origin of the technology that would eventually transform every aspect of human civilization. And its voice, the voice that spoke through that writing system, the voice that named its gods and its rulers and its cities and its children, is silent. The silence is not the result of destruction. The inscriptions survive. The signs are clear. The animals are vivid. The stone has done its job with a fidelity that mocks the frailty of meaning. The medium has endured. The message has not. If every Indus sealstone were assembled in a single room, 4,000 small, square, exquisitely carved stones, each one bearing its brief inscription and its silent animal, the room would contain the largest single collection of undeciphered text in the world. It would also contain the names of thousands of individuals, real people, with real lives, real families, real stories. Those names are there, carved into the stone, preserved for 5,000 years. They cannot be spoken. They cannot be read. They are, in the most literal sense, unspeakable, beyond the reach of any living human voice. A civilization that can build a city with a sewage system, but cannot tell us the name of a single resident. A culture that can standardize the weight of a merchant's balance across 1,000 kilometers, but cannot tell us the word for justice, or fairness, or trust. A society that carved the most beautiful animal art of the Bronze Age, but cannot tell us what the animals meant. This is the Indus Valley Civilization as we know it. A civilization of staggering material achievement and total intellectual silence. Somewhere under the silt of the Indus floodplain, there may be a tablet, a clay tablet, or a stone slab, or a copper plate, inscribed with a text long enough and varied enough to crack the code. There may be a bilingual inscription buried in the ruins of a trading post where Harappan merchants met Mesopotamian scribes and left behind a document in 2 languages. There may be an archive, sealed in a room that collapsed before fire could reach it, preserved by the same geological forces that buried the cities in meters of sediment. The possibility exists. It is small, but it is not zero, and as long as it is not zero, the search continues. But if the tablet is never found, if the bilingual text does not exist, if the archive was written on palm leaves that rotted in the monsoon rains 4,000 years ago, then the Indus Valley script will remain what it is today, the most beautiful, the most frustrating, and the most complete silence in the history of human civilization. A code that has not been broken, a message that has not been read, a voice that has not been heard. The seal stones sit in their drawers and their cases, The unicorn stares, the bull turns its head, the fish sign repeats its enigmatic sequence. The signs march along their horizontal lines, right to left, 5,000 years old and perfectly preserved. They are waiting to be read. They have always been waiting to be read. The Indus scribes who carved those signs did not know they were creating a puzzle. They were doing something ordinary, something as routine as signing a document or stamping a package. They were marking their property, identifying their goods, dedicating their offerings. They were doing what literate people do. They were writing, and they were writing with the assumption, the perfectly reasonable, perfectly justified assumption, that their writing would be understood. It was understood, for centuries, by millions of people across a territory the size of a small continent. The assumption was correct. It remained correct for as long as the language lived. The language is dead now. The assumption has failed. And the signs, carved with such confidence, preserved with such fidelity, displayed in such abundance, stare out from their stone surfaces at a world that cannot read them. They are not damaged. They are not faded. They are not fragmentary. They are complete, pristine, perfectly legible examples of a writing system that functioned flawlessly for centuries, and that has been functionally mute for millennia. There is no more complete illustration of the fragility of human communication, and no more humbling reminder of the limits of human knowledge than a message that has survived everything except its own comprehension, and they may wait forever.